Welcome to CMDA Matters, the premier podcast resource for Christian healthcare professionals. Here's Dr. Chupp with this week's installment.
Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, and you are listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. Well, we have a very special video podcast today with Dr. Walt Larimore. He's one of CMDA's best-known family doctors since 1994, who's been a frequent guest over several years on Christian Doctors Digest, the program that Dr. David Stevens, our CEO Emeritus, hosted for many years. If you're not familiar with Dr. Walt, let me give you just a few background details before we get started. He is a prolific author and has written or co-written 40 books, as well as 30 medical textbook chapters and more than 1,100 articles in various medical journals and lay magazines. His books have garnered a number of national awards, including 3 Gold Medallion Award nominations, as well as a Book of the Year award from ECPA. Well, here at CMDA, he's known for co-creating the saline solution as well as GRACE prescriptions. He's been a member of CMDA for nearly 50 years, with many of those as a lifetime member of CMDA. Well, I asked Dr. Walt to join me on the podcast this week to talk about his latest book, a completely different genre and topic for Walt after years of publishing popular medical books. This new book is called At First Light, a true World War II story of a hero, his bravery, and an amazing horse. I found this to be a powerful and true story, written by Walt and co-author Mike Yorkie, about Lieutenant Phil Larimore, who's Walt's dad, who graduated as the youngest officer ever from Officer Candidate School in Fort Benning, Georgia, at the age of only 17 in 1944. The Larimore family, including Walt, were completely unaware of the heroics of their dad until at a 50th wedding anniversary celebration, it opened up the floodgates of Phil's memories, and the incredible stories finally began to be told. As we prepare for Memorial Day, this is a wonderful story, I think, that will honor the heroes who served in World War II. And it comes from one of our own here within CMDA. I can't wait for you to hear more from Walt, so please keep watching. Well, today on CMDA Matters, it's a great privilege for me to welcome Dr. Walt Larimore, who's been a longtime friend of CMDA, a prolific author, family physician who's been involved in so many different media projects, written over 40 books, and got his start with CMDA at the beginning of a good friend of mine's start, Dr. David Stevens. I think you told me last year you met Dave at the registration desk at a national convention, did you not?
It was the then CMDS National Convention. It was in Dallas in 1994. Dave was coming in to interview for the position as national director, they called it then. And I was there, first time I'd ever come to a CMDS convention to present the basics of what became the saline solution. And it was a funny story, Mike, because when they called, and Hal Habacher was the national director, and he called and said, I think some of our members would like to know how to share their faith, and you guys are doing it in your practice. I think we can probably get 25 folks together for a little seminar out of our attendees. I said, that's fine. So I came, and when we were at the registration desk, Hal said, boy, we goofed. He said, we didn't get the number right. And I said, well, if no one's showing up, that's fine.
He said, no, everybody wants to come to your seminar.
That's right. Out of 500 attendees, there were 25 who didn't want to hear that. And so, Mike, that's where saline solution began, later became GRACE prescriptions, and now has morphed into this wonderful series of videos that CMDA is making available to its members and to others called Faith Prescriptions. It's just been a wonderful venture. I guess now we're 20, almost 30 years together, working together on that. It's been a treat worldwide.
It's made a huge difference, Walt, and many lives have been touched, and we're now in the second, or if not third generation of those that you've trained, who now are training others to be able to share their faith and practice. And you regaled me with many stories of those early days, trying to convince the South Region director that it was okay to stay in the United States and not become a missionary, but actually share your faith with patients right here in the United States. But at the same time, your eyes really perked up and you got really excited telling me a story that you were preparing for what might be the most exciting writing project of your life. And that would be to write about what you discovered about your very own father, Phil Larimore. Tell us how in the world you discovered that your dad was somebody even more special than you even knew him to be all those years. You're the oldest of 4 boys.
I am. And back when I was a kid, in the 50s, war movies and war stories and war heroes were all the thing. In the neighborhood, we played war games, if you would. And a lot of the boys talked about the roles their daddy had in the war. And I wanted to be able to brag about my daddy, my daddy's better than your daddy or whatever. I knew, my brothers and I knew he had fought in the war. We knew he lost his leg, but he never talked about it. And we would ask Mom, how come he won't talk about it? He said he just doesn't want to talk about it. And he never did. And then on he and Mom's 50th wedding anniversary, it was 1999, my brothers and I were gathered with Mom and Dad, and a pastor where Barb and I were attending asked me if I would preach that year. July 4th was on a Sunday. If I would preach on why freedom isn't free. And so I used that Mom and Dad's anniversary, which was in June, to sit down with my brothers and Dad, and we just started asking some questions. And I don't know, Mike, if it was nostalgia or he had gone to a couple of reunions and began to feel comfortable talking about things, but he opened up that night and told us some stories that, well, quite frankly, were just unbelievable. But we loved hearing them, and he loved telling them. And then over the next 4 years before he passed away, he began opening up and telling stories. He was a Boy Scout leader, and so he told stories to the other leaders, to the boys, to folks he worked with. And even the unbelievable stories had a consistency to them. And that begins to make you think, well, maybe there's some truth there. He passed in 2003, Mama passed in 2006. And when she passed, we found a military footlocker up in the attic, opened it up. It had his riding outfit. He was an equestrian. It had some of his uniform, and it had over 450 letters that he had written to his mom and to a girlfriend and to his dad and to best friends. And I was just stunned at the depth of emotion in those letters, the battles that he described, the difficulties, the suffering, the sacrifice that he went through. And as we were beginning to actually go through the letters, got a call from the Pentagon, and it was a general at the Pentagon saying, "We understand that your dad has passed away, and he has a special area in Arlington reserved for him." And why does he have a special area? And he said, well, don't you know how famous he is and what he did? And I didn't. We knew he had a shadow box with medals in his office. We knew that he had pictures signed by generals saying, "To a fighting man and to the best soldier I commanded." But as we began to dig through the history books, we found that the stories he told were documented in history. And as I went to the National Archives, I found that the stories he told were documented there, even down to some court transcripts for a battle that he fought that we can talk about later. But anyway, started putting this together in a document just for my brothers and I, and it grew to 1.5 million words, just because of the documentation of all the battles and everything that happened in Europe. And I have a writers group that I was meeting with, and one of the writers, our members and listeners will know of Jerry Jenkins, and began telling Jerry that I thought maybe this would be a nice novel to write. And Jerry said, well, Walt, a novel to be successful, a novel has to be believable. But a nonfiction book to be successful has to be unbelievable. And your dad's story in this record is unbelievable. So make it nonfiction. And so 16 years of work started in 2006, and the book has just come out finally after all this time.
Congratulations. And your co-author, Mike Yorkie, is someone you've worked with in the past to publish at least one of your 40 books. Is that right?
Yeah, Mike and I worked on the book, 10 Essentials of Highly Healthy Teens, a book for teen mothers. And I have written another 40 or so books myself, but this book was rejected and rejected and rejected. There were 48 rejections for it. In fact, one,
Wow.
the editor from St. Martin's Press wrote back and said, you know, you've written 40 books. I thought you would know how to write. And I guess I didn't, for this genre, didn't know how to write. And so after 48 failures, a mutual friend of Mike's and I said, well, you know, Mike's doing World War II books now. How about having him take a look at it? And so I called Mike, and he was willing to join the project. And he said, tell you what, Walt, why don't you send me the first, no, he said, send me the manuscript. Let me read it and see if it's even something I want to do. And he read it in about a week, and he called me back and he said, there's clearly a story here, Walt, but what you've done, not to be nepotistic, you've hidden your daddy's story. You're telling the stories of other men. You're telling the stories of the battle, but you've hidden his story. And I think what I would like to do, he said, I understand why you did. I understand that you want to lift up all of these men who have been forgotten, that fought on the Southern Front, and fought in Africa and Italy and Southern France, and they've completely been forgotten. Nobody knows that they did 5 D-Days and the guys up north did one. Nobody knows that they liberated the first capital of Europe, Rome, a couple of months before Paris was liberated. You know, no one knows that they had much more difficult Battle of the Bulge, a much more difficult forest battle. Nobody knows that, and you've hidden your daddy's story. So he said, let me just take 5 chapters and take a stab at it and see what you think. And so in a few days, he returned 5 chapters, and I didn't even, I just had worked so hard on the book for so long, I didn't even want to read what he did, but I had Barb, my wife, read. And after a little bit, I walked into the room where she was reading, and she had tears coming down her cheeks. And I thought, I guess it's not that good. And I said, what's the matter with it? And she said, honey, it's beautiful. He's put the icing on this cake, and he has uncovered your daddy. And so once Mike and I finished working on it, he was such a good author. We sent him out, and we had three offers from 3 publishers within 3 days, and then the book finally came out.
Well, for our listeners, the book's title, At First Light, a true World War II story of a hero, his bravery, and an amazing horse. And I shared with you just as we got going, all I could think of as I'm reading through this book, and I couldn't put it down. I can see why 2020 Page Turner Award, you were a finalist. I couldn't put it down. Burned a lot of midnight oil in the last 10 days, reading nearly 500 pages. And one of my daughters said, how did you fit in 500 pages of reading, Dad? You got too much going on. And I said, not this book, not this book. A genre that many of our listeners will appreciate, like you have shared with me, reading stories of heroism at a time like this in our country, approaching Memorial Day. It was very moving. I wonder, Walt, how many times that you were sitting in archives, military archives and libraries at Fort Benning, all over the place, D.C., that when you read about what your dad had done or what he was involved with, that it was an emotional moment. How often did that happen in the process?
The archives that are available now at World War II archives, a significant portion of them burned in a fire in St. Louis, and after that, the archives were distributed around the country. The 3rd Infantry Division, which was the main division that fought on the Southern Front, the Northern Front guys, Mike, the Southern Front guys had a big chip on their shoulder because of the Northern Front guys. You know, when you think of D-Day, you only think of their D-Day, and those guys said we had 5 of them. The 3rd Infantry Division actually had 7 D-Days. The Northern Front guys fought from June 6th to May 8th. The Southern Front, about 336 days. The Southern Front guys fought 913 days. They had the most casualties of any of the 90 divisions that fought in World War II. They had the most Medal of Honors awarded to any division. They had the most Medals of Valor. They had the most deaths. In fact, 3rd Infantry Division was between 15 and 17,000 men. They had almost 40,000 casualties. The war that they fought, the suffering, the sacrifice was stunning. And when you read the field reports that were written every day by platoon leaders and squad leaders, and then company commanders, and then commanders of battalions, and you see what they went through, the losses that they had, it's just stunning. And how do you tell a 1,000-day story, in a small book? But Dad was on the front line. He was the youngest frontline officer in World War II. He was the youngest commissioned officer. He was the youngest graduate from officer candidate school.
Does that record still stand, Walt? Is he still the youngest ever?
As far as I know, like, for example, officer candidate school in the Army usually can't get in it unless you're a ROTC grad and a college grad. And he had just finished high school. Now, he finished high school at a military academy because he was a ruffian and a hoodlum and a juvenile delinquent who just didn't like school. He had a mom worked as a legal secretary. His dad worked as a conductor. And so he was a latchkey type child. So finally, his parents, just in frustration, sent him to military school, and he was like a duck in water. He loved military school. So he graduated from military school at age 17, went straight to OCS because the war had begun, graduated from OCS when he was 17, and then had to wait a couple of weeks till his 18th birthday to get his commission as a second lieutenant. But then after his training, he went straight to Anzio, straight to the front line, and actually was in charge of what was called an A&P platoon, ammunition and pioneer platoon. And he and his guys worked all night to deliver ammunition to the front line, to set mines up in no man's land, to defuse mines in no man's land, to set wire up. I mean, literally within 10, 20, 30 yards of the enemy. And he was a frontline officer for over 15 months. And his stories are chilling. Anyone who's not read Frontline Stories, or anyone who has, one of the reviewers of the book said it's kind of like a combination of Unbroken and Band of Brothers. Mm-hmm. And because of the horse stories, he says kind of like War Horse and Seabiscuit. But to actually find, for example, when he lost his leg, Mike, to find that radio transmission that was actually recorded. As an amputee, he fought to let amputees stay in the Army. Then the Army had a policy saying, if you're an amputee officer, you're not human. I mean, policy didn't say that, but the attitude was, you're not complete. You're disabled. You're
just a cripple.
You're a cripple. He was called that. And I actually found the transcript of his court fight to keep officers in the Army. And it reminded me of a few Good Men with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise, that riveting court scene. Here I'm reading my dad in the middle of one of those riveting court scenes. Found that in the archives. I'm so grateful to the archivists of this country, the archives in Paris, France, the archives in Rome and Anzio, and the archives spread around this country are stunning. If any of our viewers or listeners are interested in going back and finding out what their dads and what their moms who served in the military did, our archives are stunning.
Why, as you look back, now that you've discovered all this about your dad, maybe it's multifactorial, but why do you think your dad kept quiet? Was it his humility? Was it there were just painful stories to recall? I mean, all those years, did he actually spend much time with his war buddies over the years, Walt?
No, he didn't, and many didn't. Most didn't. This was a common story. In fact, I just got a letter this morning from the director of a veterans organization who just finished the book. She was really kind. She said it's the best World War II book that I've ever read. But she said, my guys don't like talking about this. And I hope one of the things that'll come from the book is that men will begin to talk. But Mike, I think the war was so horrible. Dad talked later about the smells that were tattooed into his nose. And he had dreams, nightmares that lasted for decades. And as he began to age and those dreams began to go away, those smells began to go away, that was the first time he could open up and talk about it, because before, talking about it actually brought in more dreams. In fact, I was going to take him to see Saving Private Ryan. And he said, Walt, I can't go with you. And I said, why not? And he said, well, I've talked to buddies who've gone, and they said that the sounds of the bullets hitting the bodies and going overhead is exactly what we heard. He said, The dreams have gone away. I don't want them to come back. So one thing, that was one reason. The second reason was they had gone over, for adventure, and they said to kick the Heil out of Hitler, and young men, boys, teenagers, going over for adventure and heroism. And then when they got there and got into the battle, that went away. And they began to fight for each other, to save each other and to protect each other and to get back home to their parents and to their girlfriends. And that was what they fought for. And when they won that battle and when they won that war, they came back and they wanted to live the freedom that they had preserved. They wanted to leave the war behind, and they became loyal to their jobs. All of the men Dad fought with stayed in one job for life, and they were successful at that. All of them except one stayed in the same marriage for life. They were devoted to their careers, to their wives, to their kids, and to their faith, because if they went to that war without a spiritual faith, they came back with one.
So many themes that I marvel at the way you weaved various themes throughout the book. The equestrian theme, of course, your father an equestrian and trained mules, how to deliver munitions to the front lines in the midst of mud and difficult vehicles would not have passed. And Phil Larimore really rose to the top. He had the attention of the commanding officers of the company, of the regiment, and in fact, when he was finally hit by a German dum-dum bullet in his knee, which eventually resulted in him losing his leg, it was one of his commanding officers who, when he heard, I was there. I was like, that commanding officer, I love this soldier. He is just my kind, and went into danger to try to find your dad, who was buried beneath other bodies. He had been injured and had hidden himself to avoid being killed.
Yeah, that was exactly 4 weeks before the end of the war. And Colonel McGarr, who's one of the few battle commanders who didn't ever write a biography, was beloved by his men. He was one of the most awarded battlefield commanders. Dad had a Distinguished Service Cross and 2 Silver Stars and 2 Bronze Stars. Those are, after the Medal of Honor, the 3 highest valor awards they have. I think Colonel McGarr had 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, 4 or 5 Silver Stars, because he would get out with the men. It was not at all unusual. Mike, you read about a number of battles where the guys would be on the front line and he would come up there and be with them. And as Dad would say, he would put his boot, where the sun doesn't shine, to get his men to move. But he was an equestrian, and the general who commanded the division was an equestrian. They knew Dad was an equestrian. And so his biggest equestrian, I think probably the 2 biggest equestrian things he accomplished, one was he was sent in on a secret mission a few days before he lost his leg to find the Lipizzanes that Hitler had sequestered into Czechoslovakia, to document that they were there. They were in grave danger. The Russian army was coming towards the horse farm where the Lipizzanes were being sequestered, and likely would have killed and eaten them. And the reason we know that is just a few weeks before that, the Russians had captured a trailer of just over 20 Lipizzanes that were being taken to this horse farm for safety, and they killed and ate at least 18 of them. And so the Germans were concerned, the German vets were concerned about the Lipizzanes being lost as a horse breed. And so Dad was sent in on a secret mission to discover them and then find them. And then, as you know, later in the book, as a result of that, the book ends with an amazing horse story that we
don't want to have any spoilers here today for our listeners or
we won't
viewers.
Give away. But yeah, the equestrian part that weaves through there is amazing. The forgotten battles of the Southern Front are stunning and amazing. The other equestrian thing he did was, because he did lose his leg, came back to rehab. It was about a year of rehab at Lawson General Hospital, Atlanta. And then he stayed in the Army to fight for amputee officers, that they could stay in the Army. And that fight took place at Fort Myers, which is in Washington. His best friend from the war Ross Calvert was there leading the platoon of soldiers who guard the Tomb of the Unknowns. Colonel McGarr was there as the commander of Fort Myer. Eisenhower, with whom Dad had a friendship, was there now as the chief of the Army, a four-star general. And then General Young, that he had fought with, was there. So these guys all brought him to Fort Myer so that he could fight his battle to let amputee officers stay in. But it was there, he only had one leg. And in the caisson platoon, these are the guys who carry the caskets to Arlington.
For Arlington.
There's 8 horses, so there's 6 of them that pull the caisson. For colonels and above, there's a horse that walks behind the caisson. That's the empty saddle horse with the boots. And then the commander has a horse. And the commander and the guys riding on the caisson horses cannot move. They're frozen in position. So how do the horses know to move? Well, the men will move a knee or an ankle or a foot almost imperceptibly to tell the horses what to do. Well, Dad only had one leg, and the horses were trained to a 2-leg lead. So as far as we know, he's the first equestrian to ever train a horse to a 1-leg lead. And it's just, you mentioned earlier, kind of the Forrest Gumpness of this story. It was just another example of an amazing man and a truly amazing story.
Well, he would have lunches with Harry S. Truman at the White House after he got back after the war, and played bridge with Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I was really touched, Walt, by the conversation. I wonder how much you had to add, or was that actually documented, the very special, very intimate conversation that Dwight D. Eisenhower had with your dad as he's being ready to be airlifted back to the U.S. for further rehab.
Yeah, most of the conversations in the book are fictionalized because conversations have to be. Now, the trial transcript, that's there word for word, but Dad provided so much of that information by telling stories. The Dear John letter that he got, that came from his stories. Discussions with Eisenhower, with Truman, came from his stories, but not just his stories. I found the children of his best friend, Ross Calvert, they had the same stories. And so we were able to share stories and conversations. Ross Calvert, who was my dad's best friend, was a junior. Ross Calvert the third, the fourth, and the fifth are alive. But Ross Calvert the third and I would exchange letters and exchange stories. And Ross would say, no, my dad wouldn't say it that way. He would say it this way. And this is how my dad said your dad said it. So that was really helpful and instrumental. I had the children of about a dozen men that Dad fought with that were able to chip in and share how their dads would have said different things. And so what we tried to do was reconstruct language exactly as it would have been back then. Doing that avoids some political correctness. The men back then talked about Negroes. They didn't talk about Black people. They didn't talk about African Americans. And so we used the terms that they used. Dad was raised in a racist environment in Memphis, but his first assignment was to an African American platoon of what he called Negroes. And he fell in love with those men, with their love of the country, with their love of the Lord, with their love of service, their love of discipline. And it was his first assignment, actually, before he went overseas, was to be in charge of a Negro platoon. But it was there that he began to learn the value of diversity and the value of men from different backgrounds being able to serve together on a team more effectively together than they ever would be apart. Actually, when he, after he finished college and his master's degree at University of Virginia, he went to LSU to do his doctoral studies. And we were recently there for the world premiere of the book. And one of his colleagues told me, I knew that Dad had African Americans that worked with him, but one of his colleagues told me that Dad was the first white faculty member at LSU to hire Blacks on his staff because of what he had learned in World War II.
Wow. Obviously, the greatest generation was a very religious generation. There's a lot of faith that goes through the book. And also, you wanted to be sure to tell our listeners this is not the average, usual Walt Larimore book. There are a few words that you've never used before in a book. You want to just tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, there's a disclaimer at the front of the book that, the language is salty. This is front line men in the middle of battle. And so there's 4-letter words that are used. They're not gratuitous. They're always used in language, and they're not common. They're peppered throughout the book. Those men had a freedom, if you would, of violating the third commandment. I didn't feel that I had that freedom. And so I didn't cross that line. I wouldn't violate that. But there is some language used. And yet, even with that, the number of well-known Christians who were able to endorse the book, Jerry Jenkins, and then Coach Joe Gibbs, and Coach Mike Krzyzewski, and Coach Dan Reeves, wonderful Christian football coach and Super Bowl player, actually read this book on his deathbed. I didn't know that at the time, and endorsed the book. But Bill Boykin, who serves with Tony Perkins at the Family Research Council, wrote a wonderful endorsement. Trish Goyer, a Christian author that many of our listeners know. And so to have people who understand language, who understand evangelical Christianity say, I can endorse this book, the language is not gratuitous, was really meaningful for me.
Well, I have to ask you this question because one of the most remarkable stories you tell, faith woven through your grandparents were churchgoers, prayers, as far as I could tell, for your dad, and the moment that your father was shot in the leg, the story you tell is that your mom knew it instantaneously, that she was in church and it hit her something had just happened to your dad.
It was
that embellished? That actually happened. Did it happen?
Yeah, it was his mom and dad. They raised him in a Methodist church, sent him to Sunday school, sent him to vacation Bible school, really didn't help his delinquent attitude. The thing that helped him the most was actually taking care of horses that pulled the trolleys in Memphis. But they were worshiping on a Sunday morning, April 8th of 1945. This is a month before the end of the war. And she heard a shot. During the service, she heard a shot. And she knew instantly, her story was, she knew instantly that dad had been shot. And she actually ran out of the service. My granddad was alarmed and went out after her and found her in the foyer sobbing. And she said, Junior's been shot. And then they found out 3 days later with the telegram that he had a wound that cost him his leg, but that she knew. That actually is not a rare story among these Blue Star moms and even the Gold Star moms. The difference, the Gold Star moms were those who had lost a son or a daughter in the war. The Blue Star had one that was fighting in the war. And as she interacted with other moms of wounded veterans, she found that wasn't a rare story. I never had heard that before, but I thought it was important to include it in the book. You were talking about the faith of the men. Records show that there were virtually no atheists or agnostics. The old saying Dad would say, there's no atheists in the foxhole, was true, that men who came over there lukewarm about their faith didn't get very far on the battlefield before their faith began to grow. Before battles, chaplains, priests would have the priests would have increased confessions. The pastors would have increased conversions. Baptisms would go up. And these weren't, at least according to the chaplains I interviewed, these weren't just sort of insurance policies. These were men that were truly converted, who truly gave their life to the Lord. Now, I didn't see Dad's faith play its way out. Barb and I let me explain this. Barb and I came to Christ in college through the ministry of Campus Crusade for Christ. And so we were used to singing certain songs, and we were used to sharing the 4 spiritual laws, and we were used to faith being manifested in a particular way. And Dad and Mom didn't manifest that way. And so I really questioned. In fact, one night I sat down with Dad and questioned whether he was truly a Christian. And it really took him back. I think it hurt his feelings. And then he began to explain to me what happened in the battlefield, and how men prayed together, and how they sang hymns together, and how even on the battlefield, whenever they could get to a church, even if it was a bombed out, almost destroyed church, they would go to church together. And he pulled out of his wallet, I actually keep it here on my computer. He pulled out of his wallet, he said, Walt, this is the poem that I used as my prayer every night that I was on the battlefield. And they handed it to me, and he quoted this from memory. He said, no shell or bomb can on me burst, except my God permit it first. Then let my heart be kept in peace. His watchful care will never cease. No bomb above nor mine below need cause my heart one pang of woe. The Lord of hosts encircles me. He is the Lord of earth and sea. And I still get goosebumps. He said, he taught me that spiritual faith, a true relationship with God through the sacrifice of Jesus, is manifested by being controlled and empowered by the Holy Spirit in such a way that your faith comes out in your words, it comes out in your service, it comes out in your actions. And so his faith was a faith of loving God, loving and being loyal to his wife, loving and being loyal and disciplining his boys, and then being loyal to his faith by being excellent in his career and becoming one of the best known map makers, cartographers in the world at the time he lived. He would say, Walt, you don't wear your faith on your sleeve. You show it in service, and you show it in love. And as I look back on our veterans, that's what most of them did.
You, at the end of the book, share a comment, some words that every time you think about it, you say you get really weepy about what your wife Barb said to you when you finally had the book together and she read it. And you might have referred to it earlier, but just what this book does in terms of capturing and honoring your dad. Do you have that by memory, what Barbara said to you at the end of this project?
I don't. She actually, I had her write it down and then include it in the book. But basically, it was something like, Walt, you and Mike nailed it. Your goal was to restore, revive, resurrect an entire group of men who have been forgotten. And that's the men of the Southern Front that fought over 900 days in the war. And their battles have been forgotten. Their memories have been forgotten. Their sacrifice and their suffering has been forgotten. So the goal was to lift them up. Mike, when I began this project, I thought Tom Brokaw was a bit hyperbolic when he talked about the greatest generation. I mean, there's a lot of great generations. But after spending 16 years of looking at their records, of looking at what they did, there's the greatest generation. And my conviction is that our country is in a place now, I don't think it would fight World War II right now. I don't think those on the home front would sacrifice the way those on the home front did then. The rationing that they did, the victory gardens that they did. I think one of my favorite stories in the book is actually of the North Platte Canteen. Hundreds and hundreds of Midwesterners around North Platte, Nebraska. The trains, they're going east and west. Mm-hmm. There'd be 20 to 50 trains a day, packed with soldiers. And those people gave up their sugar. They gave up their butter. They gave up their flour. They gave up their gas rations to be able to drive these supplies to North Platte, cook cakes for the boys, they called them, popcorn balls, sandwiches, so that no boy going to the war on either front, whether the European front or the Pacific front, would pass through that town without knowing that they were loved, that they were being prayed for, and that they were being served. I'm not sure our country would sacrifice that way. And a recent survey showed that less than a quarter of our young men would fight for this country, would fight for the freedom that we have. And so I walked away from this project understanding they were the greatest generation, and the freedoms that we have, the liberty we have, is because we sit on their shoulders and we walk in their very, very big footsteps. And I worry sometimes that freedom may be may be precarious now. And I hope we'll look back on what they suffered for, what they sacrificed for, what they died for, will encourage us to preserve the gifts of freedom and liberty they preserved for us.
So we had a little bit of break up there, and that was just so important what you just said. I wonder if you can repeat that last 2 or 3 sentences that you just said, because you started to break up. Would you repeat that?
Yeah, I think what this book helped me with was to understand they were the greatest generation, and that the freedom and liberty that we enjoy today is because we sit on their shoulders and we walk in their very, very big footsteps. And I think that that's precarious now. It's precarious internationally. It's even precariously in some of the moral battles that we're involved in as a country now. And I hope we don't give it up. My hope is that this book will allow us to look back so that we can look forward into how do we preserve and maintain this union, the liberty and freedom that we have, that they fought for, not only for us, but for the entire world.
That is so powerful, Walt. I'm so glad that God gave you this gift of writing and gave you a dad that has an incredible story to write about. And I wonder how many authors like you are given a gift like this, where you can have, I don't know if you consider it your opus magnum or not, but it certainly is a crowning achievement for you. And I'm really glad that you persisted. As Mike Yorkie says at the end of the book, this was all about Walt's persistence and diligence to make this project happen. So where can our viewers, listeners go to get your book? It's on Amazon. That's where I got it.
Yeah, it's in all of the electronic bookstores, whether Barnes and Nobles or Walmart or Target or Amazon, of course. It's available through most bookstores. If they don't have it, they can get it within just a few days. And Mike, one of the other things I hope that this will be a stimulus for, Dad's story is a great story, but it's one of several million stories that were lost, that were never told. And so for those of our listeners and viewers that have moms and dads and aunts and uncles that are still alive, start asking questions, because all of them have stories. And to ask those questions allows that treasure chest of their experiences to be open and to be shared. And if we don't ask, many of them won't share. And those treasure chests will be buried with them. And so it's an opportunity, even in our neighborhoods and in our churches, for those who are more mature, for us who are younger, to invite them over and to just ask questions about their stories. I started doing this with an older woman in our church. She's in a wheelchair. Began to ask her some stories about growing up in the Midwest and her parents and grandparents. And they were wonderful stories. She's now produced 3 books of those stories. Now they're self-published, but they're hers, and there'll be a legacy for her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, and should the Lord tarry, for generations to come. So I hope that'll be a stimulus for others of us to explore and tell those wonderful stories that are hidden in hearts sometimes.
It seems a principle in the Old and New Testaments that we serve a God who wants us to remember. And it's by remembering, working against this chronological snobbery that C.S. Lewis talked about, but remembering that we can go back to some things that were really special about the previous generations. Thanks for challenging us this month of May as we look toward Memorial Day 2022 for remembering some giants who preserved our freedom for us and Europe and the world, really, from some very evil people. Yeah. Walt, thank you for joining me. It's been a very special interview, and I'm just wondering when the movie's going to come out, At First Light, the movie.
Wouldn't that be fun? But for all of us on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, instead of just thinking about hamburgers and hot dogs and wonderful time with family, to find stories that we can revisit, whether it's the Vietnam War or more recent wars or Afghanistan, but to find veteran stories and be able to honor them by reading some of those stories. They don't have to be long, but reading those stories to our kids and grandkids and teaching them, Mike, just as you said, to remember In fact, the book was originally titled Forgotten No More. So to never forget what we've been given.
Thanks. We've been talking to Dr. Walt Larimore today, author of a brand new book that's out at First Light, a true story about a wonderful hero, his dad, Phil Larimore. Thanks for working for 15 years to give us this great book, Walt.
Mike, thanks for sharing it. I appreciate it.
Well, you heard me share with Walt how I just couldn't put down his book when I started reading it. As you celebrate Memorial Day soon, I hope you'll take a few moments out of your busy schedule to remember and honor our military heroes just like Phil Larimore. And if you want to read this incredible story, you can get your copy of At First Light on Amazon or at most other booksellers. And if you'd like to hear more from Dr. Walt, be sure to visit his website at www.drwalt.com. You can also find other books by Walt, including the Natural Medicine Handbook, in our CMDA bookstore at cmda.org/bookstore. You know, Walt is so well known around CMDA for his incredible work with Dr. Bill Peel in developing the original saline solution as well as Grace Prescriptions materials. Through that program, he's helped train thousands of healthcare professionals to be salt and light in this dark world. We know that witnessing to Christ's work in your life is not an option. It's an imperative. And in the book of Acts, Christ's final command before he ascended into heaven was that his disciples will be my witnesses. Pointing people to Christ is certainly our mandate, but it is also an incredible opportunity. Those of us who serve in healthcare, various professions, have the best opportunities to point individuals toward the Lord Jesus. One of our big priorities here at CMDA is to help train healthcare professionals to integrate their faith into their practice of healthcare. Because of this legacy that Walt and Bill gave us through the saline solution and Grace Prescriptions, we have released Faith Prescriptions, the third iteration of this powerful program. This on-demand video series will teach you to share your faith in ethical and appropriate ways with your colleagues and patients. It will teach you to pray with patients and much, much more.
What happens after you finish those academic years and get into your clinical years and you realize that the physical healing that you're providing is really only temporary? You know, the first time that I sat down and I actually offered to pray with a patient, and amazingly they said yes, when I actually sat down to pray with them, I didn't know what to say. And I was kind of scared to begin with because I thought I needed some lofty words to reach to heaven, when in all actuality, that patient just really needed me to sit with him and to hold his hand and to really just bring his needs before the great physician. Prayer is a therapeutic intervention, and it is just as important as that prescription that you write, the referral to surgery, or any therapy that you send a patient to.
Ladies, we want you to know you're invited to join Women Physicians and Dentists in Christ, known around here in Bristol as WPDC, at their 2022 annual conference, September 15th through the 18th in beautiful Newport Beach, California. Their theme this year is from Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, which says, "Come to me," Jesus said, "all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Workshop topics will include burnout, setting your boundaries, sleep and well-being, dementia, dealing with difficult patients, end-of-life care, importance of exercise and rest, trusting God, prayer life. Wow, there's so many more topics. Student scholarships are available for currently enrolled medical and dental students. And actually this year, there'll be a men's track available for those whose husbands want to come and be with them. So please join the ladies of WPDC for a weekend of fun, fellowship, and worship as you find rest in our Savior. want to take a moment now to say thank you to those of you who've already responded to our big announcement just a few weeks ago. If you happen to miss it, a small but highly committed group of our ministry partners provided your CMDA with an incredible $320,000 matching gift offer. If you haven't responded yet, it is not too late, and we still have a ways to go to claim that entire $320,000 match by June 30th, the end of our fiscal year. Thank you in advance for considering your most generous gift today. If our stewardship department can answer any questions or assist you in any way, you can give them a call, 888-230-2637, or email them, stewardship@cmda.org today. To give online, you can visit cmda.org/give. For decades, Dr. Walt Larimore has been using the skills that God has obviously given to him to share his faith with his patients. And perhaps even more importantly, he's been using those skills to teach others, just like me and many others, to do the same. As you learn how to do that through faith prescriptions, and as you share God's love through healthcare, you are bringing the hope and healing of Christ to our world. That's what matters most to CMDA, and CMDA matters. We'll see you next week, God willing.